So I was sitting there one day in an undergraduate psychology class that should not be a shocker to anyone who's listened to the show before. And Dr. Selgus, who was the professor of psychology at the Harrisburg Area Community College, mentioned the word neologism. A neologism is a newly coined word or expression. So of course, being me, I immediately said out loud in the class, you just made that up. And hilarity ensued. Speaking of neologisms, new terms that are made up and are actually used, hopefully in a very cool way. They're not required to be cool for the definition, but my guest today has some great neologisms that he's going to drop on us. Dr. Stephen C. Hayes is our guest today. My favorite of his neologisms that he's going to drop on us today is wowfulness. That's wowfulness, having a sense of wow about the world around you. We're going to talk about why that's important, along with a lot of other things. Dr. Hayes is the pioneer mind behind ACT, which is acceptance and commitment training. It's a model very, very steeped in the way that our cognitions work and the way that our internal thought life interacts with the way that we feel, the depression and the anxiety that we deal with, and some very interesting ways to deal with trauma and misery, and ways to improve the quality of your life. Let me quickly mention to you this week's charity. As you know, we highlight a different charity each week here on the show, and this week's charity is the Posse Foundation. Posse Foundation is a charity in New York City that seeks out diverse, high-achieving students, most in urban communities, and they help to formulate a plan and a path from high school all the way up through the college career, training to be leaders in America. That's something you should definitely go and check out. That's possefoundation.org, possefoundation.org. Dr. Stephen Hayes is with us, live but not live. Thank you, Steve, for being here. Yeah. Welcome. I've been watching some of your information, the things that you've done with some TED Talks and putting some things out on YouTube. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that, but I just, it made me even more excited than just when I'd read your bio to be able to talk to you today. Let's start. I always have people start out by talking a little bit about who they are and how they got into such a sordid business as psychology, and a little bit about that.
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist. I do basic research also on language and cognition and how that has changed how we interact with the world, try to understand really why is it so hard to be human. And the reason I got into the field is basically I looked around me and I saw these two very loving people, mom and dad, not know how to get around their own way, just individually and between them. And so there was domestic violence in the home and alcoholism and depression and OCD and anxiety and tranquilizers and all of that. And in that era, they went and talked to the priest. That's it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, I made a decision early on. I'm going to try to figure out how to help people. And soon enough, discovered part of the people I need to learn how to help was myself. And was lucky enough to develop a panic disorder and solving that and then trying to dive into the geek science of why is it so hard to be human as sort of the story of my life. And I'm, just coming up to retiring from the academy. I'm 72 years old. And so that little paragraph I just gave you is a trajectory that covers close to 50 years.
That's pretty good. It gives you a lot of insight into your own psychology to start studying others. I know I was willing to working in the field before I discovered a lot of my own things of anxiety, and I self-diagnosed with panic disorder as well before I was sort of diagnosed professionally with bipolar disorder, which made more sense. But so it is very interesting, the introspection. You started from that point of introspection, just that curiosity was within your own home.
Yeah, I think just a yearning to help. A lot of folks who are working in the field know something about human misery inside their own head and heart or what they see around them. And frankly, there's so much of it there that if you open up to it, it's one of the central questions of life, of humanity, is why is it so hard to be us? And So, the professionals who get to work on that in a way are kind of lucky because we are asked to deal with these deepest questions of meaning and purpose and what life is about and things of that kind. And I kind of like the idea of doing that and doing that aided by Western science. So that's that, trying to square that circle. Can you really do both? But who is there anybody listening who's not like looking around in the era of COVID and stuff and wondering, man,
Yeah.
we're all afraid, we're all worried, we're all distressed. I mean, it isn't 1 out of 5 or mental illness; it's 5 out of 5
Yeah.
people.
Well, they talk a lot nowadays about being trauma informed. You hear that, and I like that discipline. I like that focus. I had a boss years ago before trauma informed became sort of the thing, who talked a lot about grief awareness. That he dealt and specialized with that. But I like the term you use there of being focused on misery, and I really like the phrase "Why is it so hard to be human?" Because I think that's another one that everybody should be able to relate to. Especially now that we're all in that low-key anxiety all the time.
Just minutes ago, I was looking at my dog, who, if you give her what most human beings have, she's as happy as she can be. I mean, she couldn't be happier. I mean, to scratch behind the ear, a little bit to eat, place to lie down. I mean, it's pretty. And, there are human beings who don't have even those basic things. And for that, anyone would understand. You're living in a war zone, you're starving, But, everybody listening to you and I right now is above that level. And yet we know that among the folks listening, and by the way, the rate is higher among the shrinks, there's this astounding rate of human suffering. How is that possible when we can manage so many other things that the rest of creation is struggling with? And turns out, I think, that it's because the very tool that allowed us to solve those other problems has turned on us and has created this whole other set of problems. And that's really the story of my work, and not just my work, but folks who are trying to dig into the underlying processes that are involved in human misery that come out of this evolutionarily recent thing, what you and I are doing right now. Talking, reasoning, thinking, all great when you're doing your taxes, fixing your car, planting your corn. Really horrible when you get down to dealing with COVID and peace of mind and who are you anyway? And there's all those deeper questions.
I have a friend who's a prescriber with psychiatric medication, especially. He always likes to talk to people about anxiety and say that you can't do math problems while you're running away from a bear. And while that's true, and it's a great way to illuminate anxiety to someone who needs that psychoeducation, I think, though, that one thing we don't always think about is the fact that if we are running from a bear, and you can all tweet at me or email me and say, hey, that's not the best way to avoid a bear. But trust me, I have a friend who's a real outdoorsman. If I ever say that, he's like, don't run from a bear. Anyway, that's a different, probably a different podcast. But that's a good way to describe anxiety. However, we don't mention that running from the bear is the function of anxiety, or in that moment, the real urgent panic. Whereas if I'm sitting down worried about a presentation or what my boss thinks of me or anything, that's not what anxiety is usually is designed for evolutionarily, right?
Yeah, I mean, running away from a bear is great when it's an external bear that can bite you, etc. But if you're running away from a bear that's inside your history, it's inside your memory, it's inside an abuse history, it's inside a trauma, how fast are you going to have to run from that? Faster than the speed of light. You got to break away from your whole self to be in some other alternative universe. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Yeah. And yeah, I'm with you. I mean, at the height of my own panic disorder, I mean, I was taking tranquilizers and I was eating beta blockers and I was doing all those things. And even when I made the turn that led towards ACT, for a long time, I just kept reducing those medications, but I didn't stop them overnight. And yeah, it's helpful insofar as it's helpful. But some of this is like the warning lights on a car. Some of this is you're feeling anxious or you're sad or depressed or whatever for damn good reasons that have to do with your history. And so if you had a oil light blinking on your car and you found a little switch you could throw that would turn it off, would you then say, woohoo, my car's fixed?
That does sound like me, unfortunately, but I would understand that it was not a good idea.
But we can find biochemical switches to throw that will throw off the warning lights.
And
And it doesn't mean that they're not. Don't be sending me emails. I know there's a role for this. I just cop to the fact there was a role for it in my own life. But as the central thing, I mean, 1 out of 4 women in the United States of America last year were on antidepressants. Does that make any sense? The answer is no. There is no scientific reason for that. It is so far out of whack that it's almost beyond, the sentence that you can say.
And that's one of the things.
Yeah, inside that, you're not going to maybe feel depressed, but also, by the way, inside that, you're not going to feel joy either. I mean, it pulls both of the highs and lows down. You want to use it when it's necessary and shorter term, lower dose, and get the things going that can last long term. These things aren't made to be used for the rest of your life, and they're not made to be used with 1 out of 4 women, and that's just one example.
Yeah.
I mean, we're so over medicating. Something's wrong.
Yeah, it's one of the and one of the problems is that with the oil light, if I did throw that switch, and even if I went and installed the switch so that I could throw it, one of the things that I'm going to run into is that the car will die before too long. I mean, oil light particularly. I think you have a few minutes to pull over before the engine's ruined for good. Well, with our own psyche, we can fight or flight or freeze for a long, long, long time, especially if we self-medicate or, as you put it, there's more appropriate medication, but you're talking about kind of beyond that of saying, how can I treat this in a way that's going to allow me to work through it more? And we can be at a mediocre all the way up to a strong level of misery, really for decades, if not the rest of our lives.
We can, but we function inside those limits. It's like the car, not running very well. And so our relationships aren't working very well. We're trimming down, opportunities at work. We're not taking advantage of things that require some risk, uncertainty, some emotional challenges. Instead, we're kind of living inside a small box. And we have to say, it does include the car breaking down. I mean, you just look at the suicide rates of adolescent.
Yeah, I should add, the rest of our life is sometimes cut quite a bit short as a lot of these things actually become terminal conditions with suicide.
Exactly. So we got to be careful about turning off the warning lights. I mean, as a kind of a place to create a little bit of space to do some serious work, okay, but short term, lower dose, taper it down. Meanwhile, let's focus on processes that will liberate people. And it turns out, I mean, part of what is kind of I've spent my life figuring out is essentially how to hack the human mind in such a way that you can get the smallest set of things you can do that do the most work in the most areas. And the most arrogant thing you'll get me to say here in the next hour is we think we've got the best supported smallest set that does the most work in psychological flexibility. And it's in most of our wisdom traditions, our clinical traditions. It's in most of the work we're doing, but it's a little better when you really know why those things work. You can focus it a little more. And it's not everything. There's other things to add, other things that are important, but it's a lot. And that's what I'm trying to put into my writings and books and talks and all the rest of that, and sort of spread that message so people can use those processes to help liberate their lives.
Well, and I appreciate that. As you're saying, there's always people who listen to the show know that I'm a big fan of anyone who, first of all, takes that responsibility that you just did, which is to say, this isn't everything. But then also, I also really appreciate someone with the confidence to say, but I didn't just make this up yesterday. This is something that I've been trying and has been quite effective from the work that you've been doing. And I want to, this is a good time to jump into that a little bit more and say, what kinds of things have you found to be helpful? And you can tell us about developing ACT and what that is. And just where do you want to lay on us here?
Well, I have some TEDx talks that sort of walk through my personal history and this night on the carpet where I finally realized that I've run this string out as far as I can go, and panic disorder is going to take everything from me, basically everything, even my ability to give a class to undergraduates. And I turned in a different direction and could feel immediately that it had some traction. And then we spent about 16 years kind of in the darkness. Most people didn't know that we were doing it, talking to very small groups of people, but doing geeky basic studies. as to why is it so hard to be human. And it went all the way down to, we actually got to the point of things like, what is language? What is cognition? What is a word? What is a symbol? I mean, it was really, 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 really basic stuff. But we then built that thing up into something that you can use clinically. The early work you can do to help children who don't have language functions, autistic spectrum disorder kids, etc. But for most of us, what's happened here, I think, is this. The story is pretty short and pretty it's a really short story. We're the ones who invented symbolic learning. We figured out how things can stand for and relate to other things arbitrarily. We can give names to things. We can compare things. This is better than that, the opposite of that, faster than that, etc. And it isn't limited by formal properties. Non-human animals can relate things if it's what's actually in the material stuff they're looking at. They can recognize which is the bigger or the darker or whatever. But we can say, a nickel is bigger than a dime. Mm-hmm. I mean, excuse me, a dime is bigger than a nickel.
Well, we can say either one. I mean, one's more accurate, certainly.
In fact, that's a good example in that very mistake, because we've got the formal world we live in, but then we've got the made-up world we live in.
And it is fascinating. Money is one example I often use about that. It's fascinating to look culturally at what different cultures appreciate that way. And like you say, and for you think of a little kid, their natural inclination is, no, I want a nickel. I don't want the dime. Dime's smaller. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it all is made up.
Yeah. Well, there's the joke told. Can I tell a joke?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Of the 6-year-old who has a 9-year-old brother, and the 9-year-old said, well, my brother is so dumb. Here, watch it. I'll show you. Okay. Here's a nickel and here's a dime. He said, give me a quarter. Give me a dime. Okay. And give me a nickel. And then he'll put it out in front of his brother and say, here, which one do you want? You want the nickel or you want the dime? And the 6-year-old takes the nickel. And then he says, oh, look, my brother, he's so stupid. And he goes over and says later on, how are you so dumb? You're embarrassing me in front of my friends. And he says, I know the dime's bigger, but if I said that, they'd never give me the damn nickel. Yeah, there's a transition, and it happens there somewhere around, 3-4 years old, where you get to be able to go to arbitrary. But if you can say that a dime is bigger than a nickel, why can't you say, yeah, I've been successful, but I should have been so much more? What is that movie recently about the J.P. Morgan? Where he asked what he, about a year ago, that movie came out, they asked him, he was the billionaire on the planet. Oh, what does he need? And he said, more. You can have everything and still want more. So here's what's happening, I think, is that we have this evolutionarily recent thing. It's only 200,000 to 2.8 million years old. How do we know that? Because the chimps don't do it. They don't. And we split off about 2.8
Not yet. Give them a couple million. They're catching up.
So somewhere in there, the hominids might be able to die. We don't know exactly where, but somewhere in there, we were able to arbitrarily relate things. And we can say more, even if we got everything, right? And that's cool when you're imagining worlds that never been, maybe with rocket ships, or we'll go live on Mars or whatever.
But it seems like it very rarely equates to that. There are times, right, where we all pull together and the more becomes exploratory, or even the research that you're doing, or that does happen. But I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. I mean, look at what you and I are doing right now, Dwight. I don't even know where you are. You may be thousands of miles away. We're talking in real time. Somebody had to do more inside their geeky little, electronics thing that allowed the computer and all that kind of stuff to happen. And we have so many things like that. But what has happened is, because that's been so spectacularly successful, we've got wrapped around the axle of problem-solving evaluative language. And you don't have to be but about 3-4 years old before, once you got more applied to anything, you start wondering, am I good enough? Yeah. Am I pretty enough? Am I lovable enough? Am I smart enough?
And it's a heartbreaking thing. You hear your own kids start to say that from a young age, of like, oh, yeah, do I look okay? Or is this all right? And you're like, yeah, who told you it wasn't? Nobody really sometimes. I just figured it out. Nobody. I figured it out that it wasn't.
Nobody. You will torment yourself with all of these things, and then of course the parents say, "Oh no, no, you're beautiful. Your nose isn't too wide," and or whatever the thing is, right?
Right. Right.
And it has about as much help for them as your parents talked to you had, which is basically zero.
No.
Because you're going to devalue it, and you're going to have other things to worry about as fast as you replace the ones that you eliminate to worry about. So you got carrying inside you that ability.
Absolutely. And we live and work within that same system. And so even to say you're beautiful is reinforcing that system.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad we're seeing it. It isn't just, I'm the worst, the lowest, the low. I could be the greatest of the great and the grandest of the grand, and it's the same process, and it'll produce the same misery. We found in our work, that what happens, the first two things that happen, one is that you get wrapped around judgment. The next one is you start judging your own reactions, and you only want the good ones and not the bad ones. So, out with the mad, out with the sad, in with the happy, in with the joy, and you got to hang on to it. You got to cling to it. You can't let it slip away. Well, that's one of the most miserable ways to live your life known. And you learned it early on. I mean, if you have small kids in the house, they say, "I'm bored, Mama. I'm bored." If you ever try not to be bored, it's the most boring thing on the planet. I mean, we've learned early on that emotions, when you try to target them and change them if they're negative and put in positive ones and cling to them, that combination is a train wreck. They don't leave quickly because now you're focused on them, the negative ones, and the positive ones, when clinged to, are no longer positive anymore. They're an addiction. And so we have this judgment that we get entangled with, including self-judgment, and this emotional and experiential avoidance, and it starts narrowing us down. Those are two of the 6 processes. And then the next step is we start telling a story about ourselves, and we get wrapped around that instead of catching that we're an aware human being connected in consciousness to others. And when you do that, you start ruminating and worrying instead of showing up in the present moment. And now you can no longer even read where you are. You're living inside some narrative or story that's full of comparison. You're filtering out, if you do that, the title of your podcast refers to the brain. If you actually do the work and the fMRI studies and stuff, you can see that your narrative self starts filtering out sensory motor information before it even gets to the parts that you can judge on. These midbrain structures are saying, "Oh, that doesn't fit, that doesn't fit, that doesn't fit." And you're no longer living in the world you're actually living in. You're living inside the story.
And then it's an interesting thing, because when you talk about, and you talk to people, and I think any of us probably have had some experience with this, that whenever we've done something truly pathological or got caught up in an addiction, it's not uncommon for someone at some point to say, why did you do that? How could you have done that? And the first thought we have is, I don't know. A lot of times it's, I don't know. We're caught up in playing a role into what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, that happens. The lack of knowledge happens around, for example, emotional knowledge. Alexithymia, not knowing even what you're feeling, goes along with these experiential avoidance processes that are inside the act, and they're hugely predictive of bad outcomes. By the way, they're male type. Males are worse on I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'll just isolate that quote and just males are worse. I would just play it.
We're really bad at I don't know. I'm
going to make it my text message sound when I get a text message. Males are worse. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, so we almost dumb ourselves down, and then our brains start cooperating. They will literally filter out stuff that contradicts the narrative self. So if you've got a negative narrative, you can't see things that are positive. You got this narcissistic narrative, you can't see the way that you're wounding and hurting people around you. You literally, if you're inside an addiction, you have no idea what the impact it's having on the people you love very often.
And it compounds itself with relationships too. It compounds itself when you notice anybody who's talked to anybody as an outsider of their conflict. I think especially therapists, you talk to people about the subjectivity of perception, and even though everybody can get there and go, yeah, I get it, I'm not always right. In my head, I think I'm always right, because 5 years ago, when you said ABC and then I said DEF, no, I said DEF. Nope, I know for sure that you didn't. And it was like, you actually don't know for sure that they didn't, but I know for sure that the people I thought said things did.
Well, and the people listening think they get a pass. I mean, this is so powerful that, especially therapists, this is one reason why I don't think we do any better than others in terms of things like divorces and all the rest. Because just because we know about that, we think it doesn't apply. No, it does. Get together with your sibs and talk about what happened in your childhood. And you'll find out that, no, that didn't happen. You're mixing two stories. That, we went to the Grand Canyon after that thing happened. No, you're wrong. And you'll get like three different, depending how many sibs you got,
remember
versions of reality.
My grandfather, I remember going to these reunions where he would sit there, and he had 11 brothers and sisters in rural Idaho. And there would be this discussion. All of the ones that were alive would talk about which horse they owned when. Oh, no, I rode Sugar to school. You did not ride Sugar to school. We didn't have Sugar till you were married, and it was this big thing every time.
Yeah, exactly. And, the cognitive scientists will tell you you're actively restructuring those memories even every time you talk about them. So it's actually getting worse as you begin to discuss it, because the whole thing's like a moving target. Well, so cognitive entanglement, emotional avoidance, this wrapper, getting entangled with a conceptualized self instead of this more witnessing spiritual sense that we have of just being here, and losing the present moment inside of rumination and worry. And then the final thing that hits, the other two processes, are not knowing what we really want to be about in our life, in part because it's emotionally painful very often. It opens you up to places where you can be wounded, but we kind of forget that, life is short, and what are the values that you want to put in your life is a really important question. And then you organize your behavior around these kind of avoidance processes or self-concept processes, good, bad, or indifferent, doesn't matter. And you miss the opportunity to build habits around what you most deeply value and care about. So those are the six. If I slow them down and say them with a name, it would be cognitive fusion or entanglement, emotional openness or negatively experiential avoidance, flexible attention to the now versus disappearing into the past and future, this narrative self as opposed to this more witnessing spiritual self, owning your values versus just pursuing your latest achievement or money or whatever it is that your mind tells you have to have before you're okay, and then not being able to build habits of values-based action. Those are the six, and they'll predict about 60% of anything you want to name in the world involving your mind. And part of what's cool about it from that point of view is that when you're dealing with mental health, you're opening the door to something that will help you deal with physical health challenges, relationship challenges, business challenges, sports, diet, exercise, and on it goes, because those six predict really anywhere that the human mind goes. And that's not just la, la, la. I'm sitting on top of about 4,000 studies and saying that, a lot of which are done by folks who came out of the ACT effort, nearly 400 randomized trials and several thousand studies on the basic processes. So, and by the way, they do really apply to other clinical methods, our spiritual and wisdom traditions, psychedelics, you name it. There's lots of things that move these processes. And so knowing what they are, I don't have to be grabby about it, saying act duberalis, act. Buy my books. That's great. I'm glad if you know the word act. But really what I care about more is take this information about this hack and work on your emotional cognitive openness, your ability to come into the present moment from this more spiritual point of view and focus on your values and get your feet moving in that direction. And if you do that, life will open up and the world around you will be lifted up.
There's a large part of cognitive behavioral or rational emotive behavioral therapy is some of that education, which we're talking about now, right? The education of how you got to where you are. In some disciplines is at least almost as important as what you do next, right? What you do to rehabilitate is only useful if you kind of know how you got there, right? And it sounds like you have a similar kind of, I mean, you didn't attribute that ratio of importance. I just did that, but it sounds like you have a similar, there's a very important psychoeducation component to ACT.
Well, whenever you take a science point of view, when it's finished, it gives you rules. It gives you verbal rules. I mean, that's the product of science. So But you can have science about things that aren't rule based. You can have a science about how to hit a baseball, and it's not going to be to know the parabolic function of the ball when it's hit. It just won't. In fact, if you're thinking about that, you're going to strike out, because those few milliseconds will make the difference between hitting the ball and not hitting the ball. So what I'm saying on the end of a scientific journey sounds like the instructions will pull the weight, but in fact, most of what we've learned in that kind of work, I think a lot of therapists know, is that this requires experiential learning. And for the reason that you were just talking about earlier, you just come in and say, no, you're thinking about that wrong. Next thing we're arguing about whether or not we're riding sugar to the, to off the farm. I mean, we're going to, or that horse showed up later. You get into literal truth instead of this functional truth of knowing how to deal with that thin cortical overlay that allows us to do literal things. And then know that there's a lot more to you. I mean, the rest of creation does very well, thank you very much, without what you and I are doing. And frankly, sometimes they're a lot happier. So we need a place to be able to, for example, find peace of mind, to be able to relax, to be able to go sit by the side of a pool and really kind of be there, or look in the eyes of your lover and really feel how connected and wonderful this moment is, or hug your kids, and blah, blah, blah. Understanding is kind of the booby prize. But I do think science leads by understanding, but some of the understanding we need is how to build these processes into our heads and hearts experientially. And that's a lot of what you find in the ACT work. If you pick up an ACT book, or watch a tape or something, you're going to find ACT, by the way, is acceptance and commitment therapy, or if you're using it outside of therapy, acceptance and commitment training. And if you were to do that, you're going to find a huge amount of emotion and silence and connection and spirituality and stuff like that, because, frankly, there's more to us than blah, blah, blah. There's more to us than what you and I are doing right now.
Yeah. I remember hearing Michael Pollan, who's the author who writes about food and plants and the way they interact with people. He's doing a TED Talk where he said, we think we're pretty clever because we're aware of our cleverness. We're conscious. But he compared about the survivability of plants. And he mentioned that grass has really made a strong comeback from, by allying itself with humans. Even though it's not conscious, it employs us as its caretakers. And we go out every Saturday and push this machine around, and we go out and work really hard on planting seeds and, those kinds of things. We are in some ways subject to it to help it survive. And it did all that without ever thinking. And so it's interesting as you say that, to be able to, it's like an extreme mindfulness we're talking about, being in the moment and not overestimating it.
As being able to be moved by consistencies in the world outside yourself, inside yourself, and the relationship among them. And actually, grass in some sense is more conscious because, for example, it'll move to follow the sunlight. If you ever watch plants, when they do those time lapse things, and they do, no, they don't have learning. They don't learn by, rewards or something, but they actually do have purposive behavior. And then, around 541 million years ago, if we as creatures on the planet learned how to learn by association and by contingencies. And that's why the Cambrian explosion happened. That's why I used that 541 million years ago. And then 2.8 to 200,000 years ago, we came up with this brilliant invention, which is wonderful. We can send, spaceships up, and, Musk can figure out how to land them even now, which is all cool. And we're the only creatures that suffer amidst plenty, that take ourselves out by our own hand, so we better learn how to harness this wild tiger we're riding of human consciousness, which is a big step forward in consciousness. But we're not. The reason I mentioned that thing about consciousness is that I think there are good reasons why we appreciate, the awareness of our pets or of animals and so forth, and opening up to that and not being so arrogant actually gives us a little bit of guide. We need a little more dog and cat wisdom. I've actually done research on that, back in, can I mention the study we did back in the day?
Yeah, of course.
It's kind of fun. It's actually kind of what happened after that transformational moment and building the ACT stuff. we started thinking that really what the problem was this domination of verbal rules, that just kind of took us over. And so we would bring folks into the lab, and we'd have them like pushing a button to earn points worth chances on money prizes, or to move a light through a maze or something like that. And here's what happens. If you have a non-human animal working, let's say, on a schedule where they're pushing a button, and the harder the work, the better to do, and then you flip it, and what they need to do is slow down and have a pause and then do something before they're going to get the goodie, okay? Right. Every creature on the planet learns that really fast, except one. Humans don't. And so we would come in and say something like, push the button to earn points for a chance on money prizes. And you could disconnect the button and walk away and come back an hour later, and the poor pathetic guy's going, bleh, 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 bleh. And you put it on a schedule where the faster you push, the better you do. And then unbeknownst to you, flip it to where you have to kind of wait. Something more like catching the bus. It doesn't matter how many times you look, the bus ain't coming faster, but you need to look right before it gets there.
You got to look.
Catch it, right? Well, the sensible thing is don't look very often, but occasionally look, okay? That's what every other creature on the planet does when it shifts like that. And so they're working and they're working. Finally, they get exhausted. It looks like not working at all. They pause. Finally, they start again. Of course, it hits because now they've paused. And what do? They start pounding again.
It's a soda machine. It's a soda machine rule, right? The intermittent reinforcement.
Exactly.
Or more destructively, gambling.
Well, no, of course. Yeah. And I've live in Nevada, so we know about that. And of course, the psychologists are in the back rooms there working this thing out with the gambling devices. Mm-hmm. They know full well how to use these contingencies, right, to capture people. But the combination of rules and contingencies produce these anomalies where we don't have the common sense of a horse, a dog, or a cat. We just don't. We're just so dumb. You want to make that relevant. I tell this the story that maybe the men in the audience can understand. You probably know full well if you're into these conflicts with your wife, you need to get to a point where you just need to shut up. But really, what you want to do is explain how you're really right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you finally are exhausted. You're letting go. Things are starting to lift up, but you still want to make that point that you're right. Just shut up, man. It's so hard for us.
And it undermines apologies. One of the greatest things in communication training is don't apologize for them being wrong, right? That's the way we submarine apologies. I'm sorry that you thought I was wrong because you're crazy, And well,
I'm sorry if you felt,
and it's funny as you mention that, because one of the more powerful questions that I ever learned when doing couples counseling is to stop and unfortunately, like you say, this is weighted a lot towards men, and stop and say, I want you to really think through what's the final objective of this conversation. If I am trying to convince you that I'm right, are you waiting for the time where they're going to go, you know what? Yep, call it off. Never mind. Not mad anymore. Done. And most of us get, well, that's not going to happen, but I still have to do it. And just like the button.
One of those rigidities that's inside this new evolutionary thing of human language, because what it fights for is coherence, and that's really close to being right. And that's fine when you're answering your multiple choice question in elementary school. It is not fine when you're talking to your spouse.
Yeah.
It is just not helpful. And it's really hard for us, as entangled as we get.
Well,
to sit inside something like being able to appreciate the perspective of another person and let it stop at that point, to be able to open up to the emotion of another person and let it stop at that point, to take their perspective, to feel empathetically what's going on there, to focus on what's important for them and not on you. I mean, it's on it goes. And it's just one example of how many ways that the human mind gets in the way.
And it gets darker too when you look at things like Milgram's work, right? Where it's like, well, why did you do that shocking, even to where you might have shocked a guy to death? Well, guy told me to. He said I had to. Those were the words. You have to. Those. If anyone has ever watched those videos, those were the words. It was just you have to. Okay. And a lot of people will do it.
Story, we'll give our reasons. We did a study years ago where we asked people when they're in the early act work, who were depressed, why, and they would give reasons, verbal reasons. Turns out the more reasons you had, the more likely it was that you'll be depressed. going forward. But on one hand, it really seems like reasonable that you would want to figure out and have all the reasons. No, sometimes actually what you need to do is back out of your mind, let the reasons do whatever the reasons do, and focus on what else is possible outside of analytical, judgmental mode of mind. And we all have it, and we need it. If you see a sunset tonight, Dwight, you're not going to go, yeah, it needs a little more blue. The pinks over there is a little off. That cloud's misshapen.
I don't know who made this one, but gee.
Yeah, you're not going to do that. You're going to go, wow, right? Well, you can do that same thing when listening to the suffering of another, or when looking at how hard it is for you to be human. You can just, bring wowfulness. I think it would be a better name even than mindfulness. Bring wowfulness to your experience. And then let it stand there. Don't then go on to explain the pinks and blues and cloud shapes that need to happen for it to be practically perfect in every way. I mean, that just takes you away from the experience that's there. And some of that experience you need is experience of painful moments, an experience of understanding what it's like to be with somebody you love who's suffering. And these experiences of connection and so forth are more like watching a sunset than they are like doing a math problem.
So run me through a little bit of this. If I'm a student of ACT, or I'm going through some ACT work, and I've gotten to where, okay, I get it, like the premise, I've gotten that. Where do I start? What would I start doing in order to practice this? Because it sounds really good. Where do we go from there?
Well, you're going to need to learn some skills as to how to move those 6 inflexibility processes of cognitive entanglement, emotional avoidance, rigid attention, conceptualized self, and failure to have values and committed action around it. And you're going to have to take the elements and kernels that you have. ACT will put them together into kind of a protocol, but you can draw from all the things in the clinical traditions, wisdom traditions, etc., and move that process. And part of what's cool clinically about that is the processes change quickly. The outcomes change slowly, but it gives you immediate feedback. It's like shooting a basketball. If you can see it go through the hoop, you can work on your technique, but you got to see it, and you got to see it fast, quick enough to learn. And these long-term outcomes of depression, anxiety, panic, and stuff, man, those things are weeks, months away. And you can do things suppressively that blow up on you so you can get misdirect. So, for example, how about this cognitive entanglement part? Well, we got on that early, and we started generating crazy-ass things that you can do, some of which we found, like we found Titchener's word repetition exercise that he came up with in 1907. He never used it clinically. No one else had ever used it clinically, but we started. He wanted to show that without a context, words lose their meaning. And so he'd have people repeat a word. We've now done the parametric studies, and we know you got something that's really, really painful, that's just punching you in the gut. Distill it down to a word, say it out loud fast, at least once per second for 30 seconds. Just do it. 30 seconds. You don't have much to lose. Within 30 seconds, this believability is down to a fraction. And then the distress comes right behind that. And you begin to notice that it's just a word if you were to put into words what the process is like. And that little bit of what we call cognitive diffusion, it's a made-up word, is a neologism. It's not diffusion. Our first made-up word was deliteralization, and I could never say it fast, so we made another made-up word. But
that's good.
That's one of several hundred diffusion methods that we've come up with, and at least 50 or 60 of them we've tested in controlled studies. That particular one of Titchener's word repetition has been tested in probably about 30 studies. And who would think that that would be helpful? Well, many people, if you drew it up, they'd say it's a little goofy. But in fact, it will compete with things like cognitive reappraisal, like sitting down and rethinking it, thinking it out. What is the evidence? Which is all fine if you can do it and not get suppressive about it, which is tricky.
Me of that.
But you can do word repetition. It's not tricky.
No, and it doesn't take very long to see how it's working for somebody too. It reminds me
of a time when I did word repetition.
Yeah.
Can I give you an example?
Oh, sure, of course.
Okay, so I'm at Stanford. It's this big session on evolutionary medicine, and I'm giving a talk, and I'm talking about how much we spend on sleeping medications and this huge rise. The point being that even the most simple human function now, we're using chemicals to aid us to do. Sleep, sex, everything. right? But and I have this graph, and it wasn't labeled, and it had a 3 over there, but not what and so I said, and it's gone up to $3 trillion last year. Well, it was $3 billion worth of sleeping medications. 3 trillion is like pathetically ignorant. I mean,
That's bigger. I'm not a mathematician either.
Anybody who knows that. So I'm a dead sleep. I said, and I'm still in the hotel room at Stanford. I leap up out of bed and I said, $3 trillion. It was recorded. I said it at Stanford. You idiot. You idiot. You're so stupid. And by the fact I said it a couple of times, it reminded me. And meanwhile, I'm wide awake. I'm pacing back and forth. So I sat on the end of my bed and I said, stupid, 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 stupid for 30 seconds. Then I went back to sleep. So, it's just one of many, many, many examples. There's fun ones. Say your depressed thoughts or anxious thoughts in the voice of Donald Duck. Say them in the voice of Donald Duck, or say them in the voice of your least favorite politician. I won't guess who that might be, but whoever it might be, you can do that.
Most people don't have strong feelings about that nowadays.
Nowadays they certainly don't. We do this with children, and they pick out who they want to do it. We call it silly voices. And you get these huge immediate reductions on things like fighting on the schoolyard and things like that are, oh, that's not fair. That's not, and next thing you know, they're in some sort of tussle, especially, kids are emotionally disturbed, et cetera, and have some of that kind of impulse control kind of stuff. We can give them a tool they can use in 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. We'll do silly voices.
That's really interesting. Now that's a pretty good Donald Duck, by the way. I can make the noise, but I can't make words. I, a couple of times, had my kids, if they were squabbling when they were, might have some old, they're teenagers now, but when they were younger and they'd be squabbling, I had them sing each other complaints to each other. That was just, I was just sort of trying to break up the pattern. And it was interesting because they actually thought it was really stupid, which helped because they started to laugh. But also I noticed that they started to actually verbalize, I don't like it when you take my stuff, or whatever. But
I bet you they could be heard. And not just that it was less upsetting to them, but the other person probably could hear it a little better.
Yeah.
That's an awesome, I'm going to steal it.
Yeah, do it. All
right, well, you just recorded.
There's no evidence that it came from me, so don't worry. There's only you and me, and now for the 5 people listening. But, I've seen in trauma therapy, too, where people will do, and I'm interested to see what you think of this, when people are talking about their trauma, sometimes they'll pick up a pillow off the couch and hug it, or they'll get all closed. And I know for a long time that's been something to say, try saying the same thing with your arms open, or even standing in a triumphant pose or something. And so it reminds me a little of that kind of work.
Absolutely. Well, there you're sort of going where I was saying, the clinical traditions have been onto this for a long, long time. It's just helpful to know what the processes are, have a name for them. And then you can measure them, and you can also see whether or not things we've been doing all the time that maybe we haven't been studying, did it move the process? And you can see it right in session. I
like though some of the focus you have on distilling it down to a word or a code or something that isn't just rehashing the full story. That's very interesting. It makes it feel to me like you're kind of doing what you referenced earlier about the memory part of the. Cognitive psychologists say that the more we access a memory, the more we repeat the story, we change it every time. And so in a way, you're kind of, it seems like you're going the other way around, right? You kind of, when you say hacking.
We're accessing it in a different context. And what happens is it begins to change its function. Mm-hmm. And you begin to have a broader range of functions that are there. So of the hundreds of diffusion methods that include, by the way, these kind of body things, show me with your body, now try it in this form, because you can express psychological inflexibility with these body postures of closed down, turned in, eyes closed, head over, fetal position. Psychological flexibility, when we just ask normally, show me with your body, you at your best, they should give you a metaphor for psychological flexibility. They open their eyes, they lift their head up, put their arms and hands out. We've done this around the world, people in burqas, with their arms wide. It seems to be a universal language. But, if you can sort of distill down to some methods that allow you to interact with these things that have been narrowing your repertoire and squeezing you down, like these depressive thoughts or these self-judgments or shame, or, you're increasing response flexibility. You're increasing psychological flexibility. There's more things you can do now when you have playfully, even perhaps. Or sometimes I don't want to make it feel as though we're making fun of the mind. I ask people, for example, when they're dealing with self-criticism, to confront themselves as a younger child and pick a time when things first start getting hard for you, and then have that in imagination, that young child called you. Say those words that you're saying to yourself right now in his or her little voice. People start crying when they do it. Yeah. And they also see, I often, a kind of a piece of compassion. When I ask people, what would you do if this were actually happening? What would you do for that kid? Almost always they say something like, well, I'd hug him, or I'd let him know it's okay. But we can get in front of the mirror brushing our teeth and just rip ourselves out a new orifice. I mean, come on. It's so unkind that we will do inside these judgmental processes and self-attacking. So, yeah, I think we're playfully, perhaps, or not always with smiles, sometimes with tears, adding different ways that we can respond to these core issues that have been grooved over and over again, just neurobiologically grooved into obsession or avoidance or depressive withdrawal or addiction or urges or whatever the particular cul-de-sac is when people come in struggling. So doing almost anything, singing it, dancing it, almost anything, as long as it's really different, will open up a space for you.
I like disrupting the pattern is what you're talking about, right? Disrupting the unhealthy patterns.
Absolutely. I was talking to a guy recently who had this is another one, there's a fusion exercise, who says when he sort of catches this thing where self-judgmental, etc., he's got a cold pool in his house. The guy's got a fair amount of money, and he keeps it at 50 degrees. And so he'll be engaging in this talk and stuff, and he jumps in the cold pool. And instantly everything stops. And like, whoa!
This is like the nuclear version of splashing your face with cold water.
Yes. Well, the DBT folks, Marcia Linehan with her dive reflex or grabbing onto
the dive reflex. Yeah, that's exactly what I use a lot of DBT in my work as a clinician, and that diving reflex. But Marcia's
a pal. I knew her before DBT, and anywhere Marcia can go, Zach can follow, and she's been so good for the world, with her skills. Absolutely. Now she talks about it in terms of distraction, and that's fine. And for folks who are cutting or something on the way to more openness, I would rather have them holding on to an ice cube than self-harming. But, some of it also is this shift of perspective that happens. And, you're kind of shocked into the present moment in a different way. You jump into a cold pool and your normal blah, 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 blah is going to shift really fast.
Yeah.
And it's in our, by the way, if you go to Russia or something, they'll put you in these really hot saunas and then you jump in a cold pool. I mean, it's kind of in our cultures. People have figured out ways to sort of push the reset button. And psychotherapy is just the latest kid on the block.
I like that you're gathering those kinds of things, because I do feel like, philosophy is the parent of psychology, right? And then that gets into the way that we think and the way we think about thinking. It's an interesting thing that I talk to a lot of clients that I have about the idea that if we are in a place where if I don't do something bad will happen, right? We have those kinds of problems. If I don't maintain my mental health and hygiene, something bad's going to happen. Then in a way we're forced, hopefully, let's say, in the best of circumstances, we're forced into treatment or training or all these things, and then we're much better off. Whereas somebody who doesn't have that risk associated with it sometimes can be sort of low-key, mediocre, miserable forever. and they're not going to kill themselves. They're not going to lose a relationship or a job because of it, but they're not happy and they don't understand how their own psychology works.
Well, I sometimes say to my clients, you have to time it well, because it sounds invalidating if you mistime it. You're one of the lucky ones. And it's really, really, really is true, because you flip over the pain and suffering that our clients are going through. They have the opportunity, the chance from that very motivation for finding what's on the other side. And sometimes they're very close. The places where we suffer are very close to the places where we care and can prosper. And so, if you want to pity someone, pity the numb, because they're not going to very likely be able to bounce off bottom and find a different way forward. And it's not what I would wish on anybody, my children or anyone else. But when I actually watch how it works, the happy numb is not happy. And I, look at where my clients are and I feel like, this is cool. You're at the end of your rope. There's no way out. This is awesome, because there is a way in.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful.
I'll walk through that door with them. But if we're still into yeah, but, and it's all into, I want to negotiate. I want another try at the same things that haven't worked. Support me in what hasn't worked for me, and I'll support you when it hasn't done work for you. I mean, we get into these conspiracies in which we kind of know that's not what's needed. Even clinically, sometimes we do. And I would rather go for the gusto, rather reach for the brass ring. I'd rather risk the possibility of failure in the interest of a real transformational success. Because I think our clients are not broken. People are not broken. They're whole human beings, and they have within what they need to succeed. And they also have this dictator within that's telling them what to do that is not working, that they're going to have to learn how to back out of, put a leash on it, use it when it's useful, when you're doing your taxes or fixing your car, and maybe get into that moment of wow when something else is needed.
Yeah, very well said. I really appreciate you coming to share with us. Tell everybody where they can find you and what they should be aware of. You just had one of your books is becoming a paperback, I think.
Yeah, a new trade book called A Liberated Mind that really walks through the science of psychological flexibility and how it applies to everything. And it's been out a year, and it's done really well. And hit 800 on Amazon, which is pretty good. And it is just out in paperback, so it's a little cheaper. And if people want to follow me, if they want to get my newsletter and all that kind of stuff, therapists, but not just therapists, if they just go to StephenCHayes.com, Stephen with the middle initial C, like in Charlie, Hayes, StephenCHayes.com, and click on yes, please send it to me. I will, and I don't spam people, but they can easily get out if they don't like it. Just a one-click opt-out. But every month or so, or 2 weeks, somewhere in there, I'll send out some of my blogs and things I'm doing and stuff like that. But if you don't want to do that, just acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a lot of folks out there doing it and writing about it and all of that. And I may have instigated it, but I'm no longer the only one. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of professionals around the world.
You and Marcia, they did it. They both did it. They DBT'd you, right? There's so many now that aren't just original. They've done that with ACT, which is actually a pretty high compliment.
And I encourage that. I'm really pleased by that. And I just think that's the way change happens, and no reason to get grabby about it. But,
well, great.
But I did like the match that led to it. So if you want to follow the person who did that, go to StephenCHayes.com.
Is A Liberated Mind the ideal book for a lay person and a clinician, or is there one or the other for both?
For lay people, A Liberated Mind will get you oriented towards how we got into this conundrum. And although it's a science book, it's written as kind of a think book and self-help book and a personal story. It tells the story of my own panic disorder and what was going on in my home and all that kind of stuff, things that I'd never told before, this more autobiographical thing. My first self-help book, which actually did really well, beat Harry Potter for one glorious week when it was written up in Time magazine.
Take that, Harry Potter.
It's called Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life.
Okay.
And it's still doing quite well. So that's my self-help book. But as I say, there's lots of other ones out there. If you and maybe other folks have a different flavor or a different writing style, but A Liberated Mind, Get Out of Your Mind in Your Life are the two that I recommend to people who want to try to apply ACT on their own, maybe with self-help and with support from Facebook groups and groups.io groups. And there's one called ACT for the Public. It's been going on for 10 years, about 2,000 people. Really wonderful watching people help each other, So you don't have to pay any money, really, hardly any, to find out what this message is. And of course, there's ACT therapists all around the world, several thousand.
Thank you so much, Steve, and good luck in all the things that you're doing and spreading this. It sounds like it's a really powerful method of helping a lot of people.
Thanks for the opportunity, Dwight. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was good having fun with you.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.